Why does every duck calling video tell you to practice more when the birds that flare at 30 yards already heard enough from you to make a decision? My buddy who has guided waterfowl on the Mississippi Flyway for 19 years, a guy who has called in birds in conditions that would make most hunters pack up and leave, told me something on the way to a blind one November morning that I had been hunting ducks for 12 years without understanding. He said the best duck callers he had ever been in a blind with were not the ones who made the best sounds. They were the ones who made the fewest wrong sounds. That reframe changed how I approached everything about calling, and it is the thread running through every mistake on this list. A mallard at 200 yards that hears nothing suspicious will investigate a spread. A mallard at 200 yards that hears something slightly wrong will leave before you ever know it was there. The job of a duck call is subtraction, not addition. Stop producing information that tells birds the location is wrong, and the birds will decide on their own that your spread is worth a look. The last mistake on this list is the one that makes every other mistake correctable, and it requires a phone, 10 minutes, and a willingness to hear something uncomfortable about your own calling. Stay for that one. The most damaging calling mistake, the one that ruins more approaches on birds that were already working than anything else, is calling at birds that have already committed. You know those mornings when a group banks hard at 300 yards, sets their wings, and starts descending, and the hunter in the blind fires up an aggressive comeback call right into that approach? That is not confidence. That is noise at the worst possible moment. Birds that are committed and descending have already made the decision. Every call thrown at them in that window is a new stimulus their threat assessment system has to process at the exact moment you want that system turned off. The callers who fill limits consistently on pressured public water call dramatically less than the hunters around them. They call to draw birds from distance and then go quiet when those birds show commitment. The call draws, the spread closes. Knowing where one job ends and the other begins is the foundation of everything else on this list. The failure mode on pressured public water specifically is that hunters who have been unsuccessful all morning tend to call harder as birds approach rather than less. The desperation is understandable. The result is birds that swing through at 40 yards without breaking stride because they read urgency in the calling rather than the settled, unhurried sound of a flock that has been on that water since before first light. Hail call note count is the most specific and correctable error on this list, and most hunters have no idea they are making it. A hail call, the long-range greeting sequence used to pull birds from distance, is 5 to 7 notes descending in pitch and volume. That is the authentic cadence of a mallard hen's greeting vocalization as documented in Cornell Lab of Ornithology field recordings. Most hunters blow it as a 10 to 12 note sequence because more notes feel like more effort, and more effort feels like more calling. The 10-note hail call runs past the natural cadence boundary and sounds like a person running a call, which is exactly what it is. Count the notes. Actually count them during practice until the 5 to 7 note termination becomes automatic. The birds at 200 yards, roughly the length of 2 football fields, are listening to cadence termination as much as tone. A call that ends where a real duck's call ends reads natural. A call that keeps going past that point reads wrong. The specific adjustment. Pick up the call. Run 5 descending notes. Stop completely. Do not add a flutter at the end. Do not add a breath. Stop. Wait 10 seconds. If birds show any response, that is your answer about what the correct length was. Most hunters who make this adjustment the first time report an immediate change in how birds at long range respond to the opening sequence. Continuous calling with no silence between sequences is the mistake that most obviously reveals a hunter who has not spent time listening to actual ducks in a natural setting. Real ducks call. Go quiet. Call again. The silences are not pauses in the performance. They are part of what the birds reading the spread hear and interpret as normal flock behavior. A hunter who runs unbroken sequences from the moment birds appear until they either commit or leave is not calling. They are looping. The acoustic environment around a natural feeding flock has significant silence in it, broken by occasional vocalizations, not the reverse. A 5 to 10 second pause between hail calls and a longer pause after a feeding chuckle sequence gives the birds time to hear the full picture, which includes quiet, and interpret the location as a functioning flock rather than a machine running on a timer. There is a useful exercise for this. Put a call to your mouth. Run a 5-note hail call. Set the call down on the blind rail. and physically wait until you count to 10 before picking it up again. It sounds obvious. It is almost impossible to do in real hunting conditions without practice, because the instinct to fill silence when birds are visible is extremely strong. Practice the silence in the yard before you need it on birds. The wrong call at the wrong distance is the error that comes from excitement, and excitement is exactly what you have when birds are close. When a flock drops inside 50 yards, roughly half a football field out, and begins the final visual assessment of the spread, the correct call is a soft feeding chuckle. The rapid, low-pitched staccato sound a comfortable feeding group makes when birds are actively working a food source and undisturbed. The quack has a specific meaning in mallard communication, and that meaning does not match what a settled flock looks like at close range. Throwing a loud hail call at birds inside 25 yards is the audio equivalent of someone yelling a greeting at someone standing next to them. Intensity should track inversely with distance. Aggressive at distance, minimal at close range. Most hunters invert this relationship because they get excited when birds are close and call harder into that excitement. The transition point worth marking specifically is 50 yards, roughly half the length of a standard football field from end zone to end zone. Before that distance, a hail call or greeting sequence is appropriate if birds are still evaluating from altitude. Inside that distance, the only call that adds value is a soft feeding chuckle running at roughly 2 calls per second. Not 3, not 4, 2. The chuckle at that rate matches the authentic feeding cadence of a mallard hen working a shallow flat. More rapid than that sounds like alarm rather than feeding. Slower sounds like nothing a duck ever said. You have had that morning. Birds working the spread, making pass after pass, clearly interested, clearly evaluating, and clearly not committing. You hammer the comeback call every time they bank away. Same sequence, same intensity, same result, on every pass. 4 passes in. Nothing has changed, except the birds are getting more skeptical. That is the moment that separates experienced callers from hunters who have learned sequences but have not learned to read birds. Birds that circle multiple times and do not commit are telling you that something in the setup reads wrong to them. Running the same calling sequence on the 4th pass that failed on the first 3 is not persistence. When birds demonstrate through their behavior that they are not responding to a calling style, the adjustments are silence, a drop to feeding chuckle, or nothing at all. The call is not why those birds are not committing. Calling more is not the fix. The call to the whole sky mistake is one that nobody talks about, and one I watched my guide buddy correct in one sentence on that November morning. In a flock working a spread, there is almost always one bird that is making the decision first. The bird that banks toward the spread before the others. The bird whose wing beats slow while the group is still moving. The bird with its head tilted down reading decoys rather than scanning the horizon. That bird is the decision maker. A comeback call timed to the moment that specific bird banks away, directed at the exact second that bird completes its turn and is moving away, will pull that bird and the flock will follow. A comeback thrown at the general mass of the flock at no particular moment hits nobody specifically. Watch for the first bird that shows commitment. Time the call to that bird's departure point, and you are making a specific argument to a specific decision maker rather than broadcasting into open air. This is the single adjustment that produced the most immediate improvement in my calling results in my experience on the water we hunt in western Minnesota. I cannot explain why it took me 10 years to hear it explained plainly. The related adjustment. When you identify the decision maker on a circling group, note which direction that bird's head is pointed when it banks toward the spread. That bird is reading your decoys, not the horizon. The moment its head comes back up and it banks away, that is your comeback window. The bird has assessed and is now leaving based on what it saw. A call at that specific moment is speaking directly to a decision that is still open. Most hunters miss this moment entirely because they are watching the group as a whole rather than the individual bird making the group's choice. Comeback call timing within a sequence is more precise than most hunters realize, and the most common timing error is throwing the comeback too early, during the bank itself, rather than after the bank is complete. Birds in the initial bank are still executing their movement decision. The wing beats are still adjusting. The flight path is still resolving. A call thrown at a bird in its bank interrupts a decision that is still in process. A call thrown 2 to 3 seconds after the birds have completed the turn and are now clearly moving away hits birds at the exact moment of maximum receptivity. The moment when they have left a location that seemed promising and are now moving away from it without a clear replacement destination. That is when the comeback call offers the most useful information. Something back there is still calling. The 5 seconds between bank completion and call feels like an eternity in the blind. It is the most productive window in duck calling. Most hunters cannot wait it out. And the second timing error, which compounds the first, is blowing the comeback and then immediately blowing another one because the birds did not respond instantly. One comeback call delivered at the right moment. Then silence. The birds either respond within the next 4 to 6 wing beats, or they have already made their decision, and another call will not change it. Calling into the wind is a setup error that produces a calling error because the physics of sound travel are working against you before you blow a note. Sound travels dramatically better downwind than upwind. A sequence thrown directly into a 15-mile-per-hour headwind loses roughly 30% of its volume before it reaches birds that are positioned downwind of you on approach. The callers who consistently draw birds from the longest distances position themselves so that the call carries toward the birds as they approach, which means calling downwind or at a crosswind angle. If your setup has you calling into the wind at approaching birds, you are calling at the back of your own sound profile, and the birds are getting a quieter, less clear version of every sequence you run. This is a setup problem first, which means the fix happens before you get in the blind, not after the birds are already on approach. The species mismatch is a mistake that hunters who own one mallard call make every time non-mallard birds are working the water. A mallard call on a flock of teal asks those birds for a response they are not wired to give to that vocalization. Blue-winged teal use a short, high-pitched twitter that has no relationship to the descending quack of a mallard hen. Pintail have a different call entirely, lower and more nasal. Canada geese require a completely different call family with a lower, slower cadence pattern. Running the one call you own at every species that appears because it is the only option in your bag produces at best indifference, and at worst, a flare from birds that are hearing a sound inconsistent with what they see in the decoys. Match the call to the species on the water. This requires owning more than one call type, which costs less than a box of bismuth loads. The productive middle ground for hunters who want to expand species coverage without buying 6 calls is a teal call as the second purchase. Early season in most Mississippi Flyway states runs teal exclusively for the first 2 weeks of September before mallard migration begins. Running a mallard call on those birds the entire early season and wondering why they will not work to the spread is an annual rite of passage that a $20 teal call eliminates permanently. The breathing pattern problem is one that I had for years without knowing it, because nobody told me to listen for it specifically, and it does not show up in how a sequence sounds in your hand. Amateur callers run sequences as long as their breath holds and pause when they need to breathe. The pauses dictated by breath management are irregular and do not fall at the natural cadence breaks of authentic duck vocalizations. Birds evaluating a sequence from 200 yards are listening to cadence as much as tone, and irregular pauses from breath management sound different than deliberate pauses placed at natural breaks. This is the technical error that the reference to blowing hot pressurized air from the diaphragm addresses, not because diaphragm air sounds better, but because diaphragm air gives you more control over the breath cycle and lets you place the pauses where they belong rather than where your lungs force them. Practice controlling your breathing separately from the call before you put them together. The specific practice: blow a 5-note sequence. Stop deliberately at note 5, regardless of how much air remains. Breathe normally through your nose. Blow the next sequence from a controlled starting breath. What you are building is the habit of the deliberate stop, not the lung-empty stop. Once that habit is established, your calling cadence aligns with the natural cadence rather than with your respiratory cycle, and that change is audible at 50 yards. Not keeping your eyes on the birds while calling is something I had to relearn after years of hunting with callers who never looked up from their call. The birds tell you everything you need to know about what they want to hear in the way they respond to what they just heard. Birds that bank hard toward the spread on a hail call are telling you that hail calling is working. Birds that lose altitude slightly on a feeding chuckle sequence are telling you the chuckle is right for this situation. Birds that climb slightly on a comeback call are telling you the comeback just made things worse. None of that information reaches you if you are watching your hands while you call. Put the call to your mouth, blow the sequence, and then watch the birds while they process it. Their next wing beat adjustment is your calling instruction for the following sequence, a drill that builds this habit. Practice in the yard, blowing sequences at a fixed object about 100 yards away, roughly the distance from home plate to the center field warning track, while maintaining eye focus on that object rather than the call in your hands. The call does not require visual attention once you know the sequences. The birds require everything you have. The wrong read tension for conditions is a technical error that most hunters never consider because they bought one call and blow it regardless of temperature. Duck calls with synthetic reeds, which is most of the calls sold today from Zink, Echo, or Buck Gardner, perform differently in cold temperatures than in warm ones. Synthetic reeds stiffen in cold weather, typically below 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and a call that was tuned and performing correctly on a 50-degree October morning will blow sharp and bright on a 15-degree January morning. Experienced callers have multiple calls with different reed configurations for different temperature ranges, or they tune their single call with the temperature in mind. Running a stiff, cold weather reed through the same sequences you use in October produces a different sound than you intend, and the birds hear the difference before you do. The missed eye contact on the decision maker when birds are on final approach is a mistake that happens in the last 30 yards, roughly the length of a standard bowling lane, when discipline breaks down entirely. Hunters who track incoming birds with full head movement, turning to follow them as they circle, are presenting visible movement at blind height that birds on their third or fourth evaluating pass are specifically watching for. The calling discipline of going quiet when birds commit and the movement discipline of watching birds through peripheral vision while keeping your head still are the same discipline. Both require suppressing the instinct to respond actively to birds that are close. Both produce the same outcome when done correctly. Birds that complete their descent without a late-stage flare triggered by something they saw rather than something they heard. I almost left this last one off because it sounds like something from a coaching session rather than a hunting tip. It is, in practice, the single most direct path to calling improvement available to any hunter at any skill level, and it costs nothing and requires no instructor and no other hunters to tell you what is wrong. Record yourself calling, not during a hunt, in the yard, in the garage, in the truck, a phone propped 30 feet away on a fence post, recording 5 to 10 minutes of your sequences, played back through a speaker immediately after. The gap between what a caller believes they sound like and what the recording reveals is almost universally larger and more specific than they expect. Note count errors that you cannot feel while blowing become obvious on playback. Cadence breaks at the wrong points are audible immediately. Tone quality problems that felt fine in your hand read completely different at 30 feet, which is exactly the distance from which a circling bird is evaluating your calling. The hunters I have been in blinds with who call noticeably better from one season to the next are the ones who recorded themselves during the off-season and listened to what they heard against actual hen-mallard recordings from the Cornell Lab Library, not duck call instructional videos, actual field recordings of live ducks. The distance between what you sound like and what a real mallard hen sounds like is your entire calling improvement agenda. The recording tells you exactly what is on it. The callers who get wings locked every time conditions allow it are not running extraordinary sequences. They are running ordinary sequences with extraordinary discipline about when those sequences get blown, at what intensity, and when to stop. The call is the least important part of that sentence. The discipline is everything. Pick one mistake from this list that describes your last bad morning on the water and fix it before the next one. That is a shorter path to more birds than any new call you could buy. The hunters who smell like they did not try very hard and come back with a full strap had the discipline figured out before they ever got in the blind. You have seen that guy. Now you know what he is doing differently.